He fell from the icy wall and, miraculously surviving, crawled to a cave. Inside, he found an old plane and was able to take off to save himself. But when he landed at the airport, he was met with handcuffs. No one believed his story. Look what this truth led to. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The cold crept into Michael Davis's bones long before the sun cleared the jagged ridges of the Rockies. He had risen at dawn, his breath already forming plumes of frost in the dim light, his body burdened by the weight of rope, ice screws, and carabiners that clinked with every step. The mountain loomed above him, sheer walls of granite streaked with snow and ice, a test of endurance and will that only a man desperate to prove something would dare attempt alone in winter. Michael was 42, and though he still moved with the precision of a soldier, he could feel age whispering in his muscles, in the stiffness of his back that never quite forgave him for the accident that had ended his military career. He had once been a pilot, flying sleek jets at the command of a nation that demanded obedience and skill. Those days had been filled with adrenaline and camaraderie, the cockpit a second skin, the sky a familiar home. But a spinal injury, a tangle of bureaucracy, and the slow unraveling of his marriage had pushed him into a quieter life. Now he made his living teaching survival courses to teenagers and weekend adventurers, people who wanted the illusion of danger without ever touching the real thing. For him, though, danger had become the only honest companion. It was in the mountains that he felt closest to who he had been, where silence demanded respect and death lingered at every ledge, reminding him he was alive. The morning stretched cold and brittle. He checked his harness, adjusted the straps of his pack, and set his crampons into the ice with deliberate precision. The rhythm of climbing soothed him, even as the gusting wind cut against his cheeks. Each strike of his axe echoed through the stillness. Alone, without the chatter of a rope partner or the safety net of a team, he moved upward into the vast emptiness. The higher he climbed, the thinner the air became, and with it the familiar ache of altitude returned. He welcomed it. Pain meant he still had something to fight against. As he ascended, fragments of memory pressed into his thoughts. The roar of jet engines, the clipped voice of his commander over the radio, the calm he felt as he guided a machine worth millions through turbulence or fire. He remembered the pride in his wife's eyes when she had first seen him in uniform, the way their children used to cheer when he came home. But that was years ago, before the silence replaced conversation, before she packed her things and left. The children called less often now. They had their own lives, and he was just a shadow in the corner of their past. By noon, the weather shifted. The clouds thickened, lowering over the peaks, and a flurry of snow began to sweep across the slope. Michael tightened his hood, leaned into the wind, and pressed upward. His body moved slower now, but he would not stop. Pride pushed him forward, the old stubbornness that had carried him through war zones and deserts. He needed this climb, needed to stand on the summit and feel the cold slice through him like truth. But the mountain had its own designs. On a narrow traverse, where the ice stretched smooth across the rock face, he drove in his axe and felt it slip. The crack was sudden, a jagged sound beneath him as the frozen layer gave way. For an instant his body hung suspended, every nerve firing with the realization that he was falling. The rope he had fixed bit into the surface, but the anchor failed. He dropped, his shoulders slamming against the rock, his crampons tearing loose. The world blurred into a spin of snow, stone and sky before he crashed into a lower ledge with a force that knocked the breath from his chest. Agony flooded through him. His ribs screamed with every inhale, sharp and ragged, and his left leg throbbed with a pain that told him something deep had torn or cracked. He lay sprawled on the ice, staring at the gray sky above the jagged walls that had caught him like an indifferent net. For a moment he thought he might simply stay there, let the cold seep into him until everything stopped. But instinct, the same one that had carried him through fire and smoke, forced him to move. He rolled onto his stomach, gasping, dragging himself inch by inch toward the wall. Blood warmed his glove as it seeped from a cut above his eyebrow. His breath came shallow, each one a knife to the ribs. Still he pushed forward, clawing against stone and snow, until his hand brushed an opening in the rock. At first it seemed like nothing more than a dark crack, a pocket in the mountain. But as he pulled himself closer, he realized it was wider, a narrow throat that tunneled inward. The air inside was colder, but it was still shelter. He pulled his body through the jagged mouth of the cave, collapsing onto the frozen ground. Darkness enveloped him, broken only by the pale light behind. He lay there panting, feeling his pulse throb against the pain. The cave smelled faintly metallic, a strange tang that did not belong to stone alone. When his eyes adjusted, he noticed shapes in the shadows, angular and unnatural, nothing like the smooth contours of rock. At first he thought he was hallucinating, that the blood loss and exhaustion had conjured images out of darkness. But as he crawled further, his hand scraped against cold steel. His heart faltered. There, hidden deep within the mountain, was the unmistakable outline of a fuselage. A plane, buried and forgotten, its nose tilted into the cavern as though it had tried to burrow into the earth itself. The sight filled him with disbelief. He blinked, touched the metal again, and knew it was real. Michael leaned against the side of the strange relic, listening to the echo of his own breath. He did not yet understand why it was there, who had left it, or how long it had slept in the mountain's belly. All he knew was that he had stumbled upon something impossible. His body trembled with pain, but his mind sparked with the realization that this discovery, this ghost of steel, might be the only chance he had to survive. Outside, the snowstorm raged, howling against the cliffs. Inside, the cave stood silent, except for the faint drip of melting ice and the rasp of his ragged breathing. He pressed his palm against the frost-covered skin of the aircraft and closed his eyes. For the first time since the fall, he felt a spark of something that had almost left him. Hope, fragile and uncertain, but alive. And yet beneath that hope, there was unease, as though the plane carried a secret weight, something dark embedded in its silence. He did not know it yet, but what he had found was not salvation alone. It was the beginning of a descent far more treacherous than the mountain could ever offer. Michael lay against the frozen skin of the aircraft, his breath rising in shallow clouds that drifted into the cavern's stale air. The metallic tang clung to his senses, unsettling, as though the cave itself exhaled secrets long buried. He pressed his palm harder against the fuselage, convincing himself it was not an illusion. The rough frost flaked beneath his glove, revealing streaks of dulled paint. The contours were unmistakable, the familiar geometry of riveted panels and steel bones that once cut through clouds. It had been years since he had last sat in a cockpit, but the recognition was immediate. This was no dream, no fevered trick of his battered mind. A plane, here, inside the mountain. He forced himself to crawl forward, dragging his useless leg, each movement igniting waves of pain that blurred his vision. The body of the craft stretched deeper into the cavern, its nose embedded against rock as if it had slammed into the earth and been swallowed whole. Dust clung to every surface, layers of time built upon themselves. When he brushed his glove across a window, the glass beneath was cracked but intact. For a moment he simply stared, struck by the absurdity. What forgotten history had entombed this machine in darkness? Who had flown it, and what fate had led them here? With the stubborn persistence that had carried him through combat flights and battlefield landings, Michael pulled himself to the cockpit. The door resisted at first, but then gave with a rusty groan that echoed through the chamber. He half expected skeletons, the remains of pilots still strapped into their seats. But the cabin was empty. Two worn chairs faced the panels, their leather cracked and stiff. The instrument board was coated with frost and dust, yet he could still trace the outlines of gauges and switches, the muscle memory of his hands aching to reach for them. A pang of memory struck him, the hum of engines, the vibration in his chest as he pushed a plane through turbulence, the sense of command over a machine that could defy gravity. He sat back against the cold chair, trembling, feeling the sharpness of his broken rib each time he breathed. The past rushed in unbidden. He remembered the day his career had ended, the sharp pull of the jet, the violent jolt, the pain searing his back, the ground rushing too fast beneath him. He had survived, but survival came with exile. The Air Force had thanked him for his service, then closed the door forever. Now, in this forgotten cavern, He was face to face with another kind of exile. A plane buried alive, stripped of purpose, left to rot in silence. The cavern swallowed the sound of his cough, throwing it back to him as if mocking his weakness. He glanced toward the fuselage behind him and noticed something odd. Wooden crates, broken and scattered, their markings faint but still legible in patches. Spanish words, faded stencils of destinations south of the border. He leaned closer, pried open one of the shattered boxes. The interior was nearly empty, just scraps of cloth and torn wrappings. But there was enough to tell him what they had once held. He had seen packages like that before during briefings, during missions over jungles where the enemy supply lines fed on white powder. Cocaine. The truth sank into him with a chill colder than the ice at his back. The plane had not been lost to accident alone. It had been hidden. Whoever had flown it had come here with intention, unloading, perhaps waiting for retrieval, then abandoning it when the mountain offered its eternal shelter. He felt suddenly as though he were trespassing on someone's grave, but not a grave of men of crimes. Pain surged through him again, sharp and unrelenting. His leg was swelling, every movement grinding his body closer to collapse. He knew he could not survive long here. He needed warmth. He needed food. He needed rescue. And in this tomb of steel, only one thought pressed forward, relentless. Maybe the machine could still live. He was a pilot. The plane was broken, but perhaps not dead. He dragged himself back into the cockpit, gripping the panels for support. He studied the controls with feverish concentration. Much of it was corroded, wires dangling like veins torn open, switches frozen in place. Yet when he touched the throttle, it moved stiff but not locked. His pulse quickened. Against reason, against the absurdity, a plan began to form. He tore through the cabin, searching. The fuel tanks, when tapped, gave a hollow sound, but not empty. There was weight inside, liquid shifting, the faint smell of kerosene rising. He found an old toolbox, its contents rusted but serviceable. Fingers shaking, breath ragged, he began the painstaking work of checking connections, clearing frost, coaxing the corpse of the plane toward life. Hours bled together in the dim cavern. He lost track of time, guided only by the will to survive. He patched cables, tightened screws, and forced open access panels until his hands bled. At times he nearly blacked out, the pain in his ribs threatening to drown him. But each time he dragged himself back with the mantra that had kept him alive through war. Keep moving, keep breathing, keep fighting. At last he slumped into the pilot's seat, barely able to lift his arms. He rested his forehead against the frozen yoke, eyes closed, whispering words he hadn't spoken in years. A plea, not to God, but to the machine itself. He reached for the starter, flipped switches in sequence, his hands remembering the choreography as if no time had passed. For a moment, nothing happened. Silence pressed heavy. Then a cough, a groan of metal. Another attempt, and the cavern shook as one engine sputtered to life, spewing smoke and sound into the darkness. The vibration rattled the walls, sending snow and dust cascading from the ceiling. Michael laughed, a broken, delirious laugh, tears freezing on his cheeks. He pushed harder, coaxing the second engine until it too roared awake. The cave filled with the thunder of power, and for a moment he felt like himself again. Not a broken man crawling in the dark, but a pilot, master of the sky. He could not delay. The engines would not last long in this state. He guided the yoke, nudging the plane forward. The wheels grated against rock, resisting, but the cavern sloped toward an opening, partially concealed by ice. The aircraft lurched, scraping stone, tearing chunks from its belly as it forced its way toward the light. Snow blinded him as the nose pushed free, the engines howling against the storm. With every ounce of strength left in his ruined body, he pulled the throttle forward. The machine shuddered, strained, then lifted from the jagged floor. Against all logic, against the mountain's grip, it rose into the sky. Michael gritted his teeth, holding the controls steady, every rib a knife with each breath. His leg a fire he could not extinguish. But he did not stop. Below him the mountain fell away, swallowed by white storm clouds. Ahead, through gaps in the snow, he saw the faint glow of lights, an airstrip, a fragment of civilization. He aimed for it, clinging to consciousness, his vision dimming. The landing was rough. The wheels struck the runway with a jolt that sent agony shooting through his chest. He barely managed to guide the machine down, skidding to a halt. His vision swam, the world tilting, and then it all collapsed into darkness. When he woke, he would no longer be just a man who had fought to survive the mountain. He would be something else in the eyes of the world. Something far more dangerous, a shadow draped in suspicion. He did not yet know it, lying broken in the cockpit. But the fight for his life had only just begun, and this time the enemy would not be the storm or the stone. It would be men, their laws, and their hunger for a truth that fit their narrative better than his. When Michael opened his eyes, the first thing he registered was the sharp sting of light cutting through his vision. For a disoriented moment, he thought he was still in the cavern, the engines howling, the icy breath of the mountain filling his lungs. But the sound that greeted him now was different. Voices, clipped and official, radios crackling, boots striking the tarmac. He blinked, his throat dry, and saw unfamiliar faces staring down at him, not with relief, not with concern, but with suspicion. Men in dark jackets, their insignia catching the glow of the floodlights, circled around the battered plane. Guns were slung across shoulders, DEA, local law enforcement. Even airport security standing stiff and uncertain, as if waiting for orders. He tried to move, but cold metal clamped around his wrists. At first he could not comprehend it. He had expected medics, blankets, perhaps an ambulance waiting on the runway. Instead, he was being dragged from the cockpit by gloved hands, forced down onto the icy pavement as if he were the criminal. The cuffs bit into his skin, aggravating wounds that had barely begun to clot. He coughed, tasting iron, his ribs screaming with every spasm. One of the agents pressed a knee into his back to hold him steady, while another recited rites in a monotone that seemed unreal, words meant for someone else, not him. He tried to protest, to explain, but his voice was drowned out by the storm of questions and orders being exchanged above him. They pulled him to his feet, half carrying, half dragging him away from the plane. Michael's gaze lingered on the hulking silhouette of the aircraft under the floodlights. It looked monstrous now, a specter against the snow, its engines still ticking as they cooled. He wanted to tell them what it had been, his lifeline, his only chance. But already men in gloves were swarming over it, prying open panels, searching the fuselage with the efficiency of those who knew exactly what they expected to find. When they opened the first hidden compartment, he heard the shout. White packages, old but unmistakable, were pulled out and laid on the ground like evidence at an exhibit. The realization hit him hard. They had been there all along, waiting in the plane's belly. Decades of silence had preserved them until his desperate hands brought the craft into the world again. Now he was tethered to it, bound by circumstance. He was no longer the man who had survived the mountain. He was the man caught flying a plane laced with cocaine. In the sterile room of the airport facility, the interrogation began before he had even been treated for his injuries. Two men sat across the table, their suits clean, their pens ready. One asked questions with calm precision, while the other observed in silence, eyes sharp as a hawk's. They wanted to know how he had come into possession of the aircraft, why his fingerprints were on every surface, why he had chosen to land here. He explained slowly at first, then with urgency about the fall, the cavern, the wreck hidden in the ice. He told them about his injuries, about the sheer will it had taken to start the engines. He swore he had no idea what the plane carried, that he had only flown it because the alternative was death in the snow. The men exchanged glances, unimpressed. One of them leaned forward, voice steady, and remarked that his story was convenient. Too convenient. A former Air Force pilot, trained to fly in impossible conditions, found in command of an aircraft linked to old cartel operations, claiming to be an innocent survivor. They pressed harder, pointing out the evidence, the drugs in the compartments, the fact that his hands were on the controls, that he had managed to bring the plane to life after decades of silence. To them, it sounded less like a miracle of survival and more like a man rekindling ties with a world he had never truly left. He insisted. He told them again and again, describing the climb, the storm, the fall, the pain. He described the way the cavern had echoed when the engines started, the way snow fell from the ceiling. He told it until his voice broke, until he slumped against the table, dizzy with exhaustion. They listened without sympathy, making notes, occasionally nodding, but always with the look of men cataloging lies. Days blurred into weeks. He was moved to a detention center, his injuries treated just enough to keep him alive. He sat in a cell, hearing the whispers of guards, feeling the weight of stares. The news spread quickly. On television screens, he saw his own face, a military portrait pulled from archives beside grainy footage of the plane being towed across the runway. Headlines blared, ex-Air Force pilot found flying cartel aircraft. Mystery of the mountain plane. Hero or smuggler? Each segment dissected his life, his service, even his divorce, spinning them into a narrative of decline that made the accusation seem inevitable. People who had once admired him now kept their distance. His neighbors gave statements to reporters, vague comments about how he had always been quiet, how perhaps there had been signs. The students he had trained in survival skills stopped calling. Former comrades refused to speak on record, unwilling to be tied to the scandal. Even his children, distant as they already were, left his calls unanswered. The isolation was heavier than any chain. He had faced the cold indifference of nature on the mountain, but this was worse. The cold judgment of society, swift and merciless. The prosecutors built their case with careful precision, though it lacked a smoking gun. They had the plane, the drugs, and him in the cockpit. But they lacked proof that he had placed the contraband there, lacked witnesses tying him to any cartel. The age of the drugs complicated matters. The packages were relics, their origin difficult to trace. Yet the cloud of suspicion remained thick. They spoke of his past as though it were damning evidence, emphasizing his ability to fly, his knowledge of procedures, his discipline. To them, skill itself became an indictment. Michael clung to hope that someone, anyone, might see reason. His appointed attorney spoke with tired resignation, explaining that the best outcome they could hope for was leniency, not vindication. He might avoid a long sentence, but freedom would come scarred with the mark of suspicion. Still, he refused to accept guilt. In his heart, he replayed the climb, the storm, the cavern. He remembered the desperation that had driven him to the cockpit, the way survival had seemed the only choice. That truth burned in him, but truth alone was not enough to change the story being told beyond the prison walls. As the months dragged on, hearings were postponed, evidence debated, motions filed. He remained behind bars, his body healing slowly, but his spirit fraying. Nights were the worst, when the silence closed in and he could hear the faint murmur of televisions in the guard's room, his own name spoken in tones of curiosity and disdain. He began to understand that justice was less about truth and more about the weight of appearances, the story that fit neatly into headlines. Eventually, the day came when the charges could not stand on solid ground. The evidence was too old, the ties too tenuous. A judge declared that the case would not proceed to conviction. He was released, but not exonerated. The words echoed in his mind as the gates opened and cold air touched his face again. Released, but not innocent. His record carried the stain, his name tethered to the plane, to the drugs, to the suspicion that clung like smoke. Walking out into the daylight, Michael felt no triumph, no sense of rescue. The mountain had tried to kill him, and he had survived. But this, the weight of accusation, the whispers, the headlines, was a different kind of death. As he stepped away from the detention center, he knew the world would not forget. The climb was behind him, the plane left in government custody, but the shadow of that night in the cavern would follow him forever. And yet he kept walking, because survival was all he had ever known. The air outside the detention center carried the bite of late winter, sharp and clean compared to the stale quarters he had left behind. Michael stepped through the gates with nothing but a thin jacket, a plastic bag containing his belongings, and the hollow echo of months lost to walls and suspicion. Freedom, they called it, but it felt like exile. No one was waiting for him beyond the chain-link fence, no friendly face in the sparse crowd, just reporters lingering like scavengers, their cameras lifting in unison as if choreographed. He heard his name shouted, questions flung like stones. Was he working with the cartels? Did he regret flying the plane? Would he admit guilt even now? He turned his face away, his silence feeding their headlines, and walked until the noise thinned and only the crunch of gravel beneath his boots remained. He had been released because the law could not hold him, not because it believed him. The judge's words still hung in his mind. Insufficient evidence, case dismissed. They did not absolve him, they merely set him adrift. To the world, that meant he had slipped through the cracks, not that he was innocent. He could feel it already in the way people looked at him as he moved through the bus station that first day. Whispers followed, eyes narrowed. He imagined his name whispered in households, in offices, always followed by that single poisonous word drugs. His first attempt to reclaim his old life failed within hours. The outdoor survival school where he had once worked had been his refuge, a place where he taught young climbers to respect the wilderness, where he could still feel useful. He went to the office, expecting at least the courtesy of a conversation, but the owner barely let him step inside. She looked at him with pity more than anger and told him it was impossible. Parents would never entrust their children to a man whose face had been on the news, a man tied to a drug plane. She said the business couldn't survive the association. Her words were soft but final, and when he left the building, he saw through the window how the staff avoided looking at him. The weight of it settled deeper with every door that closed. Employers glanced at his application and recognized the name. He had once been proud to attach his military record, his years of service, but now it only invited more scrutiny. Every background check spat out the same shadow: detained in connection with narcotics trafficking. Released without conviction, yes, but the stain was enough. He could not outrun it. He sold what little he had left of value, including some of his climbing equipment, to pay for a small rented house on the edge of a forgotten town. The place was quiet, the streets lined with peeling paint and shuttered stores. Here, anonymity seemed possible, though even here eyes lingered on him when he bought groceries, and the cashier sometimes hesitated before handing him change. He found work at a gas station, the kind of job where no one asked questions so long as he showed up on time. The pay was small, the hours long, but it was work, and for now that was more than he could expect. The nights were the hardest. He sat on the porch in a rickety chair, staring at the horizon as the wind moved across the flatlands. He thought often of the mountain, of the storm, of the cavern with its frozen secret. He thought of the engines roaring back to life, of the impossible flight that had carried him to safety. In those moments he had felt a fire, a defiance against death itself. Now, with the world silent around him, he felt only the numbness of survival stripped of meaning. He had fought the elements and won, only to be broken by suspicion and rumor. Sometimes the memories of his service returned at night, unwelcome companions. The cockpit lights glowing against the dark sky, the calm certainty of his hands on the controls. He had saved lives once, piloting through storms, bringing men home. He remembered the pride of wearing the uniform, the way strangers once thanked him for his service. That pride had curdled into shame now. He had not changed, but perception had, and perception was all the world required to judge. Letters arrived occasionally, mostly from lawyers still hoping to scrape a case for civil damages against the government or the agencies that had detained him. They spoke of compensation, of fighting to restore his name, but even they warned him it would take years and victory was unlikely. The government did not admit mistakes easily, and the headlines had already been written. He never responded. Money would not erase the whispers. He tried calling his children again. His daughter answered once, her voice cautious. She asked if it was true, if he had really been involved. When he tried to explain, her silence on the other end was heavier than any question. Then she hung up, promising to call back. But she never did. His son did not answer at all. That absence hollowed him more than the mountain had, more than the accusations. Surviving meant little when the people he had fought hardest for no longer believed in him. Seasons shifted. Spring melted into summer, and still he worked the gas station, pumping fuel, fixing minor issues, sweeping the lot at night when the air cooled. The job was thankless, the customers brusque, but it kept his body moving. Each day was a small endurance test, a quieter version of the battles he had once fought. He told himself it was temporary, that perhaps someday someone would believe his story, but deep down he knew the world rarely rewrote its judgments. Once marked, a man stayed marked. On one of those long evenings, as the sun bled red across the horizon, he sat on the porch again, the wood creaking beneath his weight. In his hands was a chipped ceramic mug filled with lukewarm coffee. He stared at the steam curling upward, at the scarred skin of his knuckles, at the hands that had once held the controls of jets worth millions, the same hands that had coaxed a dead aircraft back to life in the belly of a mountain. Now they held nothing more than coffee and the routine of survival. He realized then that freedom was not the opposite of captivity. Freedom could still be a cage, invisible but inescapable, built from doubt and mistrust. He had survived the fall, survived the cavern, survived the accusations. But survival was not the same as living. He would carry the stain as long as he drew breath, his story reduced to a rumor, his truth dismissed as fiction. And yet, he did not collapse under it. He sat there listening to the wind as it moved through the empty streets, feeling the weight of his solitude, and chose, as he always had, to keep breathing. The world had taken his name, his reputation, his place, but it had not taken his will. That perhaps was the last piece of himself he could still claim. The night settled around him, and he raised the mug to his lips, his eyes fixed on the horizon that never answered back. He was free, yes, but free with a stain, and that was the cruelest kind of freedom a man could know. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more powerful stories still to come, and please share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too important to keep to yourself.